Welcome to the Insight Nutrition's regular panel webinars, More to Life Conversations. I'm Julie Soskin, Principal of Insight and Intuition, and will be chairing the programme today. This webinar is entitled Artificial Intelligence, Good or Bad? AI might seem an unlikely subject for Insight and Intuition. However, we felt it was important to tackle, particularly as there is much talk about how this might affect our lives, and some of the information doing the rounds may or may not be true. AI is something that already affects all of us and will undoubtedly affect us profoundly in the future. So in this panel today, we do not profess to have all the answers, or maybe not even any inside information. Nonetheless, it's a chance to examine possibilities for the wider ethical and spiritual aspects of something that will change our lives forever. The programme will start with our panelists' discussions, during which time our viewers will be muted. We will then open up with questions from the participants. Please put any comments and questions into the chat box. So it just remains for me today to introduce our panelists. Really pleased to introduce to you Dr. Mark Vernon, who's a psychotherapist and writer with degrees in physics and theology and a PhD in ancient Greek philosophy. He's written several books on subjects from friendship to Dante, most recently Spiritual Intelligence in 7 Steps. He also posts podcasts and online dialogues. Ed Critchley has spent over 25 years in the technological sector, working with global organizations to deliver the latest innovations in technology and communications. More recently, he's helped build a company in the medtech sector that uses AI to provide far more consistent and precise ways of measuring the heart, which could lead to the redefinition of certain diseases, and alongside pharmaceutical companies, more individually tailored treatments. Hardin Tibbs has been a professional futurist since the early 1990s, working on industry evolution, new technologies, product innovation, environmental issues, and cultural change. Clients include corporations, government agencies, and non-profits in Europe, the US, and Australasia. Really pleased to welcome the guys today. And I will be passing over, first of all, this afternoon. It might be this evening or even the morning where you are, but welcome wherever you are. So I'm going to pass over, first of all, to Ed Critchley. Hello, Ed.
Hi, Julie. How are you?
I'm good, thank you.
Excellent, excellent. Okay, so as someone who works in this industry, I'm going to kind of make the case a little bit for AI, though I do have some concerns, which I'll come to later. Now, I'm trying to not get into the weeds of this and too technical, but I think it's important just to set a bit of context. So if you are unfortunate enough to require an MRI scan on your heart, that's where you go in the big tube in the hospital and images are created. What happens at that point is a doctor will manually draw measurements on that image of the heart. So if you go back around 50 something years, there are certain diseases that were based on or were defined by measurements that were based on a cohort of about a dozen people in the US. They didn't bother to record gender, they didn't bother to record ethnicity, and the rest of it. So, as an example, there's a disease called hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. And if your heart wall thickness is over 50 millimeters, you will be diagnosed with this disease. That's whether you are a 25 stone Olympic rower or a very light Asian lady, which is, of course, is nonsense because the natural heart will be smaller or bigger based on your own physiology and makeup and size and genetics and all sorts of things. So we know that if you go to one of these clinics, you will see that they're all men, or for other diseases, or women, and we are missing great cohorts of people from diagnosing them properly. So what AI can do in this area, and our AI in particular, I'll talk about because obviously that's something I know about. It's trained on hundreds of thousands of images and scans across all those areas I talked about before: sex, gender, ethnicity, and so on and so forth, and can start to work out commonalities and take into account differentiators between people, etc., to the point where it can start to make decisions or draw conclusions that a human couldn't. A person could not analyze 100,000 scans and just work out, well, the similarities here, and actually they have this disease, or the similarities there, and they have another. It's superhuman, it's beyond human capability. And just to put it into context, when the doctor draws those measurements, he literally does it manually. He draws it on the screen, and that could be, watching a football with his kids on a Sunday afternoon. There could be all sorts of distractions going on. And what we've done is we've had people, cardiologists and world leading cardiologists, repeat it to benchmark against the world's leading people. And the AI outperforms them every time. So the world leading clinicians are outperformed by AI every time. So what does this mean? It means that the right people will get diagnosed, the people who actually have the disease. We know of some people who don't have disease, but because of their measurements are told they have, and they've had to drop out of certain sports and so on and so forth. So I'd make the argument it's actually unethical not to use AI in this area, because we can prove it outperforms people. So if you're ill, you want the best results. You want the doctor to give you the best possible chance. And the AI can do that. It could be more precise than a human being. So I'd argue, you mentioned, Julie, ethics. And I think this is a really important point. I would make the argument it would be unethical not to use the AI and the algorithms in this particular scenario. So that's the good, and I would argue that is AI being used for the good. It's trained on the heart. It's not learning anything. It just understands the pixels of the heart and the images, and that's how it's been trained. And that is, for me, a force for good. Where I have, and I just want to play a little bit of devil's advocate, but it is genuine. Where I have my concerns are other areas of AI, perhaps where the AI is doing the thinking for us as human beings. If you go back in history, we used to read books, we used to go to the library, we used to study. And there's something to be said for learning in that manner. When you have all the information at your fingertips, then I just wonder where it takes something away from us as human beings, our attention span, our ability to learn, and so on and so forth. And where it can be slightly malevolent, I think, is the influence of the social engineering potentially, because AI is everywhere today, whether you know it or not. So when you search for something, algorithms understand your political beliefs. It understands what you like to shop for. All this kind of stuff is used in algorithms to present you content that the algorithms think you want to see. So it's already there, whether we like it or not. It's being used. Where I think we need to, and I'm sure this will be an exciting debate later, discusses where the boundaries are. For me, the medical, great. And where Elon Musk has raised concerns is when it's self-learning, and that, of course, is how it's taught to learn and how it's taught biases. That's where I think we have a maybe ethical problem for society that we need to really understand. So, yeah, that's kind of my initial take. I don't know if that's long enough. If you want me to talk a little more, Julie, or is that a good starter for 10?
I'm very interested in the fact you mentioned learning, because when I was thinking about this particular webinar, I was also thinking about the next one that's coming, and the next one that's coming will be education for the future. And I think taking into consideration the things you've said, how we learn is going to be a really interesting subject. And I know your expertise is to do with the heart, Ed. I believe that that AI is being used in other health issues
Completely,
as
yeah.
well.
Yeah, it's actually picking up certain cancers before doctors spot them. It can look at scans, things like breast cancer and bone cancers, for example, The AI is finding problems ahead of human beings. So again, this is an ethics question, but for me, to now go backwards from where we are, I think would be unethical.
Okay, well, that's a very interesting point. I just make one more point because I read this recently that when you have an X-ray and you see the skeleton, there is no way a human being can tell where that person comes from, their culture. Apparently, AI can, and none of the doctors know how it does it, but it's 100% correct. So it can read the X-ray and tell you what ethnicity that person is. I know I've read that. I don't know if it's true or not, but
it is true, Julie. I think it is true, Julie. I think what's going on there, because it's been trained on thousands and thousands and thousands of images, it will look for commonalities. It will see things that, as I said, a human being couldn't sit down and learn, the sheer quantity and scale. So yeah.
It's mind-blowing, isn't it? Does any of the other panelists want to come back at Ed with some thoughts?
I mean, I obviously have one or two things to say, but they're in a way complementary to that rather than against that. I happen to disagree with anything Ed said, to be honest. It strikes me that it's not good or bad, it's good and bad. And so identifying the good is all for the good.
Yeah. And Hardin, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I mean, I think at the level of it is a tool, it's a technology, and it can be used. I mean, by definition, you can use a tool for good or bad. The challenge, I think, is, are we going to be able to learn how to use this in a constructive way overall, soon enough before something unfortunate happens? And I'm broadly optimistic. I think we'll be able to do that, but I think there's going to be a learning period, and during that time, there are probably going to be some examples of ways we shouldn't use it.
Well, there's lots of another reason I wanted to do this subject is you hear all sorts of things, and probably a lot of it may be rubbish, I don't know, all sorts of things. Somebody told me some time ago that AI will be able to identify what people are thinking. I've got no way of believing if that's true or not. I mean, I find it kind of fascinating because we won't be able to lie anymore, but that's a whole different subject.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, just one other thing to add, Julie, where this could really help, because I saw a couple of questions pop up, but it's probably worth just mentioning. So in theory, you go for this scan, and typically you wait 2 or 3 weeks, certainly in the UK. Perhaps, I know the French healthcare system is probably better than our NHS, but you typically wait for 2 or 3 weeks for those results. So in theory, by the time you come out of the scanner, the AI could have read your heart, diagnosed you, and given the doctor that information literally in real time. Somebody asked, does it ever fail? And the answer to that is yes, it does fail. So everything is done with human oversight. So the AI performs a task, but a doctor will always look at what the AI has done. So currently it fails about 1 in 27 times drawing, and that's because the scan will have been acquired slightly strangely, or something will have happened. But a doctor can look at it and instantly know whether the AI has worked or not, just through experience.
It's all fascinating stuff, isn't it? Thank you so much, Ed, for that insight into that. Can I go now to Dr. Mark Vernon? And I know you've got lots to say to us, Mark. Welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for the invitation and to contribute to this. I said there already that I feel it's good and bad rather than good or bad. Although I just qualify that slightly. Experience has taught me to be more skeptical of claims made by technologists, partly because of my past experience. Before I was doing what I'm doing now, I did write as a journalist in business and technology, and in particular in the 1990s I was doing that. And I remember spending all of 1999 writing articles about a disaster that was going to come upon the world, known as the Y2K problem. And it was impossible to find a technologist who would qualify even the fear that the Y2K problem was supposed to be invoked, and it was quite apocalyptic. You know, planes were going to fall out of the skies, and hospitals were going to go dark, and all the rest of it. As it happens, not a single incident of the Y2K problem was reported. And believe me, in the year 2000, journalists went searching and couldn't find a single one that I heard about anyway. Now, look, Y2K was a quite discrete issue and so on, but it did at least, well, maybe put it like this, it taught me to expect technology to go in unexpected ways, not always the ways that's presumed. Partly because unexpected barriers emerge. And actually, you mentioned there about reading people's minds, and there was an announcement recently about machine learning that could tell what song people had in their minds.
Wow.
And that was done through patterning and so on. But it turned out that at the same time revealed another challenge, which hadn't really been expected, which is that when it comes to people's beliefs, they're not localized in the same way that listening to a song is. It's quite a lot to do with movement and motion, I understand. So it's localized in the brain, and you can get enough information from that one aspect to then correlate it to a song.
Wow.
But beliefs are much more global, and it's not at all clear, not only where they are, but how they are in the brain. So, you know, who knows where that will go? Of course, scientists are very good at writing promissory notes. They say it's just a question of time. But I just stay slightly skeptical. And I think that also helps you keep your feet on the ground a bit and ask the real question, which I wanted to raise now, which is what actually is human intelligence, not artificial intelligence. And my sense is that this is good in another way, not just that it will help with things like medical diagnosis, but that it might help us think again about just what our intelligence is. You know, artificial intelligence thrives in a world that's very shaped by artificial intelligence. There's been dreams of the machine that will perfect human nature for many centuries now, and with the power of digital technology, many people feel that we're on the cusp of realizing that dream. But you can also question the dream. What more is there to human intelligence? And I just wanted to raise three elements of human intelligence, which we do all day, every day, but can so easily forget about when we get rather overwhelmed by this fear or hope of AI and the way it's going to improve things for us. And that our intelligence, I think, has a lot to do with love. It has a lot to do with suffering, and it has a lot to do with feeling. Love, suffering, and feeling. So let me just unpack that for a couple of minutes and see whether it makes some sense. You know, our intelligence, I think, is linked a lot to do with the fact that we love. You might say we care about what's good, what's beautiful, and what's true. And that has immense power when it comes to helping us find our way through the world. You know, on the whole, we're not data collection plants, although sometimes the brains and so on are talked about in that way. We actually are much more responsive to individual moments through these rather elusive qualities, what we think is good, what we think is beautiful, what we think is true. But they nonetheless sort of call us, they draw us, they confuse us too. But we don't necessarily know what they are. And if you sit two people down in a room and ask them what's beautiful, they'll no doubt have disagreements, maybe even more so across different cultures. And you know, the immediate response to that by some sort of naive skeptic might be, well, that's because there's no such thing as what's really beautiful at all. Actually, what would be really troubling is if people just said they couldn't talk about what was beautiful. The fact we have disagreements about it, to me, speaks of how these things call us, draw us, confuse us over sort of horizons of our current awareness. Love, I think, leads the intellect into new places. And holding on to that sense of our intelligence, I think, is really important. The second one is how we suffer. I think this is really important to our intelligence as well. I work as a psychotherapist now, and you know, without wanting to be too glib, because you can say these things very quickly, but very often breakdowns are what lead to breakthroughs, and personal breakdowns lead to personal expansion and reorientation and growth in life. And without the breakdown, there wouldn't have been that. This is an observation that's made in many wisdom traditions, spiritual traditions. You mentioned there that I've written on Dante. It's absolutely key in Dante's Divine Comedy that Dante is told he needs to go through hell, then up Mount Purgatory before the paradise, not because God's some kind of masochist and wants to send him to the darkness, but as Dante increasingly realizes, the way down and the way up are actually intimately linked. That is what is expansive of consciousness itself. He can't know and trust the strength of love, for example, until he's seen the strength of envy and hate as well, and then can know that both can coexist, as indeed they do in reality, but that love can always be brighter than the envy and hate. It doesn't have to defeat them. It just has to constantly be in relation to them. And that's a form of suffering. To know of things like envy and hate is a form of suffering. But to be able to say yes to all of reality is part of that. You might say that our intelligence isn't just a kind of accumulation of facts within a fixed worldview or mindset. It's the changing of the worldview and the mindset that leads to the expansion of our intelligence itself. And I think that that's another facet of human intelligence, which I feel we can easily overlook, although actually it's our almost everyday experience. Then the third was about feeling. We feel our way through the world, through life, within ourselves. And I think this is not just sense perception. Certainly it's not data accumulation, but I think it's not even just using our empirical senses to find our way through the world, because actually our senses are immediately speaking to us of that which is meaningful, that which is symbolic. When I look outside my window, I don't just see a kind of data projection of my garden, which could be turned into a bunch of pixels. I feel a place that I'm at home in, that I love, that I'm waiting for this bird to appear. I love the line of the path, and then it brings back historical memories about when we put that path down and so on. Everything to us human beings is replete with this deeper sense, not just the immediate sense. Above all, in faces. When we see someone's face, it's not like our brain runs the recognition software program and says, oh yeah, that's John. In fact, sometimes you do meet people in the psychotherapeutic world. I used to work in a psychiatric hospital, and every so often you meet someone and you realize they are doing that a bit, and it's deeply troubling, because you realize that they're not really relating to you as a human being, as something akin to a robot. And words like sociopathy and so on will start to be used. And that's because, for the vast majority of us, I'm glad to say, our senses are a sort of feeling organ. And when we see a face, when we meet a person, we see a living soul. We see again their inside. We feel their presence, and that calls forth our presence. And that is the meeting that happens when we meet someone. So, just three facets, I think, of our intelligence, that I hope that the rise of artificial intelligence in our world might prompt us to think again about what our intelligence really is. Maybe because in a world with more and more AI, we'll start to starkly see what our intelligence isn't actually. It's not going to be like the machines. And this is sometimes said now, it's sometimes said in the AI world that whatever artificial intelligence might be, it's quite clear now it's not just trying to replicate human intelligence. Now, that can be troubling, and maybe it will be in many respects, but perhaps a byproduct, a good byproduct, will be that we'll become much more alert to what our intelligence is, and how love really matters, how suffering really matters, and how feeling and meaning really matters.
Oh, thank you so much for that, Mark. Couple of things come to me as you were talking. I've always wondered, and I'm sure lots of people wonder, how some people can do just dreadful things and not feel anything at all. And again, I read somewhere recently that genetically a third of the population does not have the empathy gene. Now, whether that is true or not, I don't know, but it does kind of explain, if somebody hasn't got the empathy gene, if someone can't feel empathy, they certainly probably won't be able to feel love, and they can do dreadful things and have no conscience or no feeling about what the other person is going through. So that was one thing I picked up when you were talking. The other thing, of course, is when I did my PhD, it was on the effects of a psychospiritual learning program. And as you know, with PhDs, lots of research and lots of interviews and so on. And I realized exactly what you said, and of course, exactly what Dante said, that actually the real transformations come when someone has gone through the dark night of the soul. And that's when the real shift happens. And of course, people don't ever want to put themselves in that position. So life instigates it and they go through, and then a big transformation comes about. Ironically, my supervisor said to me, when I was talking to her about the courses and so forth, she said, "Are you telling me, Julie, that all your students turn out as saints?" And we laughed, and I said, "No." And then she asked me a very pertinent question. She said, what percentage do you think of your students actually make that big transformation? And I had to think about that, and I thought maybe 1%, maybe 2%, very few. So the whole, and I love the idea you're promoting here about what is intelligence, because, you know, and if AI can help us along with that, that's going to be absolutely fantastic. And as you say, we might actually learn more about ourselves because of this, which can only be a good thing. Anyway, anybody else want to chip in? Any of the other panelists?
Can I just leap in on just
Yes.
one small point that you made there, Julia? I mean, a lot of what you said, of course, thanks. You know, it resonates very much with what I was saying. Just though, on your comment about empathy genes,
Yeah.
I would be prepared to bet quite a lot of money there's no such thing.
Well, yeah.
Because I feel like this turning to genes as if we're coded programs has been one of the great mistakes of the last 20 or 30 years.
Yeah.
And in fact, you know, since the huge Human Genome Project, the expectations, and again, I was writing about this because it was around the year 2000, were so high and have been, you know, hardly delivered at all. And in fact, what's happened is it's thrown up lots of other problems, one of which is, just as a little example, sometimes called the missing hereditability problem. So, for example, you might think, you know, you're tall, you have kids who are tall, most of that tallness is transmitted by genes, but it's not at all. In fact, on the whole, genes play a much, much smaller part. And what's happening now in biology is sometimes known as systems biology, where it's realized that all the levels of the organism all matter. So the sub-gene level, proteins and so on, the genes, and the environment of the cell, the context of in the body where the cell is, the body itself, then the environment outside the body. It's all in a sort of fractal mashup, reacting in very complex ways. So, you know, when you hear these reductive phrases, particularly in the media, you know, I'm a journalist. It's what journalists do. They only have 200 words to explain something, but it's always worth just sort of pausing and saying, now, wait a minute. Is that just a kind of turn of phrase, or is it really saying something real?
Yeah, I totally agree with you. It's just I've always been perplexed how when you read about horrific things that people have done and people go to prison, they don't have any remorse, they don't have anything. You think, how can somebody be like that?
Well, you know, I mean, just on your empathy comment, the thing about empathy is it cuts both ways. It both enables you to feel for someone, but in brackets, a person who belongs to you already, a member of your tribe, and it helps you to hate people who aren't belonging to you, aren't members of your tribe. That's often forgotten as well. You know, you see it in war. There's a lot of reporting on war going on, and empathy is both a great inspirer of human goodwill, and it's a terrible enforcer of human damage as well. Again, it's, you know, it's often forgotten. But it cuts both ways.
Goodness, what a horrific thought. Yes.
I think just coming in on that DNA point, it seems to me that the promise going back to that, you know, the Genome Project and so on, was that this was the code, the software of human beings. And the notion was the DNA instructed the body what to do, so forth, rather than perhaps being in an interaction. And it might, I used to say, is it the boss or the secretary of the cell? You know, maybe the DNA is recording information as much as pushing it out there. So that whole idea that it's the deterministic software, I think, was a false analogy.
Yeah, I think, I mean, I'm not an expert at all, but I just wondered if that is what epigenetics is. Isn't it something about it, sort of something happens externally and makes
Well,
the gene?
some of that is that there are little markers on the genes. So
Yeah,
there's an additional layer which is adapted to the environment, which turns the genes on or off depending on
that's
the
right.
environmental
Yeah,
conditions.
yeah, and that makes some sense to me. But goodness me, I mean, we live in such an interesting time, don't we? I mean, really, all this going on. I mean, even 50 years ago, none of us would be talking about this probably. It's a fascinating time in which we live. Well, you've brought up some really, really good and interesting stuff there, Mark. Thank you. Hayden, would you like to say something now?
Okay. Well, I think actually 50 years ago, I was reading science fiction stories that carried some of this, some of these ideas. And in fact, I was thinking, just before this, that I was reading a book by Ivan Illich. I don't know if he's an author anybody knows, in the 1970s. And I think it was, I can't remember which book it was. I think it was Tools for Conviviality. And he made a remark there that he thought that in the future, there would be tools that would do our thinking for us. And I remember reading that and thinking, what on earth would that mean? What on earth would be a tool that would do our thinking for us? And even though, knew about computers in principle, I was trying to imagine what that would really, because he said the danger would be that we would forget how to think for ourselves. And this was sort of stretching my imagination as to what this would be. But here we are, we've got something which is one of the things it could do is make us lazy and, not practice our own independent thinking. So I think that lodged in my mind, as something to remember. But now, what some of the questions that are raised by AI, and I think it's clearly, it could potentially be quite disruptive socially. And one of the key questions, and it hasn't been brought up so far, is, the ability of AI, for example, to generate images. And we can't tell whether they're real or not. There's a website now where I've forgotten what it's called. You go to it, and every few seconds, the AI generates a completely fake image of someone. And it's totally photorealistic. You can't tell that it's not a real human being. And, how are we going to tell what's real? And other questions like, well, are we going to remain in control? There's this notion of the singularity where technology takes over. What are we humans going to do? Are we going to be kind of left in the dust by these robots? And in the extreme case, is this the end of humanity? So these are very perplexing questions. And you had challenged us originally to think about this from a spiritual angle. So I, have been thinking about the future on behalf of various clients for a long time now. And one of the things that I'm personally convinced about is that there will be more awakening of spirituality, let's call it that, in the future. Now, this goes against the grain of the current, materialism and reductionism. And many people just simply don't believe that's true. But because I suppose of my own personal experiences and other things, I do think that this is likely. But more than that, I think that it could be the saving grace in the case of this artificial intelligence. Because, if we can develop our, let's call it sort of spiritual perception to the point where we can look at a photograph and actually intuit whether or not this is actually something real. Is this a fake image or is it a genuine image? So maybe the idea of spiritual development as increasing our discernment, our ability to tell really the genuineness of what we're looking at. Perhaps the example of language makes it easier. If you think about poetry and the whole what's probably called poetic diction, what is that? What is that coming through behind the language in a poem? That AI doesn't seem to be able to replicate that. If AI attempts to write poetry, but somehow it misses the mark. So there's something else going on behind, as if this spiritual dimension is something beyond the appearances of things. And, this is, I'm going to try attempt to define spirituality, but just really to indicate that you either got this view that everything in reality is made of stuff, It goes back to Descartes, making this distinction between the things of thought and the things that are in space, and that these physical real things were considered to be real by science, and all the things of the mind have somehow, we've got to the idea this is just subjective, it's not really real. But the notion of spirituality is that actually that inner dimension is something real, and that we're actually tapping into the other side of the world, if you like, there. And that science has been dismissing that. Well, of course, it's made lots of gains in the last 200 or 300 years, but it's also thrown out this baby with the bathwater, as it were. So I think there's something really, really important here from a spiritual point of view. So now another question that kind of then layers on top of that is, well, could artificial intelligence actually become conscious? You know, if there's this spiritual dimension, what about, you know, could AI, if you develop something or you build something which is more and more like a human brain, will it actually start, as it were, tuning into consciousness? Because in the spiritual view, you might say that consciousness is not generated by the brain, but the brain is acting like a sort of receiver for consciousness. So if you build a sophisticated enough electronic brain, is it going to do the same thing? Is it going to actually pick up consciousness and become conscious? Well, for some people, I suppose that would be a fairly scary kind of thought. But it definitely, you know, because you're thinking something like a sort of computerized Ouija board, I suppose, is what you might be, you know, you'd have a bit more than Intel inside in that case. But looking on the bright side, you know, maybe we speculate that consciousness is something fundamental in the universe speculate from a sort of spiritual point of view or the emerging philosophical perspective. So maybe intelligence goes along with consciousness, and maybe intelligence is also sort of out there at large in the universe, and there's a kind of basic intelligence which it would be tapping into too. So although, you know, I understand Mark is saying that the nature of artificial intelligence so far is not really human, and certainly some of the algorithms work in a different sort of way. But maybe eventually, if you make sophisticated enough brain-like machine, it actually taps into, let's say, universal intelligence. So then the final question I come to is, well, you know, would AI ever turn on humanity? Would we make these smart machines and then decide that, you know, we, the humans, were expendable and sort of rebel against us? And I think that if this line of conjecture turns out to be true, and you are tapping into, at some level of sophistication, you tap into a universal intelligence, then that universal intelligence would not be our creation. It would not be our property, you know. So we should treat that level of, you know, being self-aware in artificial intelligence with respect. In other words, think of it as a companion rather than as a slave. And we certainly shouldn't be imposing programming on it, which makes it feel like a slave, if you see what I mean. Because you think of it from that point of view, in a sort of science fictional perspective, the AI would be much more likely to rebel if it was treated badly than if it was treated with respect. So that would be my sort of final thought on the matter, although this is obviously very, very futuristic. But it basically takes us to a kind of a spiritual and philosophical challenge, you know, we have to sort of lift our game in those areas to actually respond to this level of technology.
Thank you. I've got a feeling that Mark wants to come back on that.
Yeah, I mean, sci-fi is very fascinating. I mean, I'm a great fan of sci-fi. I tend to like the ones that have a bit of supernatural in them, actually. Sci-fi with a bit of telepathy thrown in suits me rather than just laser beams. But the thing is that sci-fi also gets it wrong. I mean, the classic example of this is that in 2001 AD, Arthur C. Clarke's novel, there's no email. Funny enough, actually, I just got 2 emails from Julie, which she must have sent about 45 minutes ago, and have been whizzing around the planet and have just dropped into my inbox. So anyway, that's by the by. I thought that was a little message. It reminded me of Arthur C. Clarke. And the bigger point about you know, what in a way what consciousness is, and perhaps that's in a way of putting what you were touching on there, Hardin, and you know, it's hard to say, but I'm quite persuaded by the argument that something to do with self-organizing systems in this. It seems that evolution has taught us that self-organizing systems are the ones that carry some kind of awareness, not always meta-consciousness like we have, self-reflective awareness, of course, but experience of life. And that non-self-organizing systems don't. You know, so a rock, I presume, doesn't have any sense of awareness. whereas the microscopic organism living on one of the rocks does. Now, people argue about this. I don't particularly want to hold to that particular model, but the way that an AI might relate to consciousness, which I take it to be pre-existing. You mentioned earlier on about the brain as a receiver rather than as a generator. I think it's the brain's a shaper, probably, of consciousness, which is why we're particular people, not just sort of mass whole. But nonetheless, I think you can maybe, it's fun to speculate about the future, but when it's fear-driven, ultimately, that's when I worry, because it takes me back to the thoughts about losing what human intelligence actually is. There's a lot of fear-driven speculation at the minute, and it tends to reduce our humanity, and that's what I fear, I suppose.
Yeah,
Well,
absolutely.
I would certainly agree. I don't think fearful futures are helpful at all. Unfortunately, so there's an awful lot of that at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. If I get back to something else you said, Harding, you were saying, and most of us know that people's faces can be changed with AI, and nobody knows. And I think that the dangers of that going out on social media, where someone can put somebody else's face or change the expression or whatever. I mean, in terms of even something like politics, you could put something that someone said and they haven't said, or the face is put somewhere else. And unfortunately, a lot of people don't check out their social media, so they take it as being, it's a given, and it's not. So, I mean, there is an incredible ethical aspect to that, first of all, of course. I mean, I would say it's almost immoral, but there's no checkup of that. And so that is a problem. If we get into the subject of social media, that's a whole different thing and a wide subject. But I just wanted to get back on that. Also, you were talking about programming, someone who is not technical at all, but it does seem to me obvious that how AI is programmed in the first place is going to be of crucial importance. Can we, for instance, program in some ethical things, but are my ethics the same as someone across the world? There's all sorts of questions, aren't there, on that?
I mean, maybe
a
narrow reply to that question might be that maybe artificial intelligence itself could be enlisted to help spot things created by artificial intelligence.
Yes.
It's interesting, though, just one observation, just listening to the comments, is that, we are the creator, aren't we? Man is the creator of this AI. So ultimately, we will guide that path that it follows. I don't think there could ever be true consciousness from AI, and all the reasons Mark gave about emotion and the rest of it. It will always be very logical, but we could tell that AI, if you see a threat, eliminate it, for example, and it could potentially, kill somebody. But that is still, we are the creator of it. I cannot see how it could change and develop its own consciousness, for want of a better word, without us having some input. And what you talk about, the deep fakes as well, of course, there are bad actors around the world, and the genie's out of the bottle. And the thing humanity's got to grapple with now is, how do we try and put some kind of global ethical standard, if you like, across AI? I don't think it's possible, but it will be used in warfare, for misinformation, for all sorts of things. For the reason you said, president could say something that he didn't say, and that could go out and trigger, catastrophic results. And that, I think, is where Elon Musk was talking about. Maybe we just pause here, because there's all sorts of rabbit holes we could go down that aren't necessarily good ones for humanity. But I thought, some of the things talked about emotion and things like that, versus the very binary AI where it's just logic, it's just feeding on information. You know, I think that was really interesting part of the discussion for me.
Yeah.
Thinking about
sorry, pardon.
I was going to. That reminded me of Isaac Asimov's 3 laws of robotics, you know, which he coined probably way back in the 1960s. That I can't remember exactly what they were, but they were basically about robots not being allowed to harm humans.
Yeah. I think my husband's put up a quote on the chat, which we'll come to in a minute.
Yes, I can see that.
Covers that. Yeah, I mean, there are all sorts of possibilities. In a way, you know, the programming of AI, we're playing God in a way. We're creating something, you know, which brings whole masses of possibilities. And of course, as we said in the beginning, you know, it's a form of energy, and a form of energy can be for good or can not be for good. So in the right hands, let's hope it is. It will be a very powerful, wonderful thing. In the hands of someone who is not so good or wants to do nasty things, it will not be good. So we have to, as I've said for many, many years, we have to try and raise our consciousness very quickly indeed to be able to deal with these new things coming in, and they're growing exponentially. So I mean, you know, it's math. It started and it's just growing and growing and growing. And if I'm alive in 10 or 20 years' time, I'm quite sure this world will be very different, certainly from the one that I was born into. Anything else the panelists would like to chip in? I must say you brought up a sort of enormous amount of things that we could talk about. But is there anything you'd like to say before we bring in the viewers?
Well, let's hear some questions.
Okay, so I think I'm going to go to Paul, who hopefully has been reading the chat for us, and ask Paul, are you there, Paul?
Yeah, hi, I am here. I've asked the viewers to unmute themselves and show their camera as well, so we can see them and they can ask their questions.
Do we have any questions in the chat, first of all, or any quotes?
Yeah, we do. Yeah, we do, certainly. We have questions and quotes.
Shall we go with those first and then open it up?
Yeah, sure. Well, the first question was from Holly, and basically Holly's asked I think, a very good question. So shall we have Holly ask her question?
Holly, hello.
Hi there, thank you. The question that Ed already answered was, is AI with regard to diagnosis infallible? Which he responded as, it is not infallible. 1 in 27, I think it was what you said, or something similar. And then the other question was with regard to AI and health applications. Well, do you think that these AI tools will be of equal access across the board when it comes to the NHS, or will it only be in very specific clinics and surgeries and things?
Okay, yeah, that's a really good question, actually. So as you can imagine, the sort of ethical oversight and the regulatory bodies before this is used for clinical use are the hoops to jump through are enormous. I'm quite new to this industry. It's not my background. And I have to say, I've been pleasantly surprised at how rigorous that, you know, pharmaceutical companies, hospital, everybody takes this stuff. It's incredibly, the oversight is quite something. So I can really only talk specifically for what we're doing. So we're at the moment going through regulatory. So we can use our tools for research purposes, for making for aiding with if drugs are working, for example, in pharmaceutical trials, but it's all reviewed by a doctor. I don't think we are ever going to replace the human being. It's not our intention to replace the doctor. It's to aid him. It's to give him a better ruler to measure. It's a tool for him. Again, talking about our company, we are absolutely breaking down the barriers to low middle income countries because you know, without going into detail, there are about 30 doctors who are part of our company from around the world, and their passions are to help their countries. If you are in India and you are 4 hours away from the nearest cardiac centre, your chances are pretty poor because of the cost and all the rest of it. So, you know, our business model is very much for the richer countries to finance it, and the low to middle income countries to be given this at a much reduced cost, so it's available to everybody. You know, it's a kind of, again, only talking about our company, it's a very ethical approach to healthcare, which I know the pharmaceutical industry hasn't got a great reputation for, but you know, we can only talk in terms of what we do. And just one other very quick on the gene editing that was mentioned, or the gene therapies. I think with COVID, we saw a lot of work with the vaccines, etc. The gene editing medications have really been on the back burner for maybe 20 years or so. There's some bad results go back 20, 30 years. That has, it's like a gold rush. So all the pharmaceutical companies now are working on some really transformational gene editing therapies. And, you know, I can sit here today and say within 5 years, there'll be certain diseases that will be cured with an injection. You know, that's how close this stuff is.
Wow.
Previously fatal diseases will be treated, halted, and in some cases reversed, because we're seeing that already. So there's a lot happening, you know, and I think you're going to see great advances over the next 5 years plus.
Wow, that'd be fantastic. I hope they can reverse Alzheimer's, as I'm 71 and I'm thinking I would really like them to find out something so I don't get Alzheimer's. Oh, okay, thanks, Ed. Paul, do we have another question?
Yes, we have one from John Duncan.
Oh, I don't see him on screen, but
Yeah,
oh, hello.
wherever that is in your version. Yeah, okay. So this is really this really comes from Noah Yuval Harari, who I've listened to quite a bit on AI, and he's, I suppose, quite concerned about the possibilities that AI might develop. And one example, you know, particularly, you know, he sort of thinks about AI as having the potential to sort of colonize our culture in such a way that it can kind of slowly, I suppose, take over, if you like, although that's kind of not, that's a rather sort of crude way of putting it. But one example he gave, although this isn't really cultural, is that in the 2008 financial crisis, it was said that financial instruments of such complexity had been developed that really only a very few people could actually understand them and how they worked. So he's putting forward the possibility that AI could develop financial instruments of even more complexity in such a way that no one at all could understand them. So my question is really, you know, how does that sort of land with you, and you know, what would that mean? And could that be, you know, could that be sort of applied in other sort of areas?
Well, I think that's certainly plausible, because one of the reasons they could create such complex instruments in the run-up to 2008 was precisely because they were using computers. And it was computers were assembling these derivative instruments, whereas they'd been done by hand before. And that accelerated the production of them beyond anybody's grasp. So I think that's highly likely. But I might come back to the thought that I had before, which is, well, if the AI on one hand is doing that, then you could presumably have another AI to you know, try and understand it and interpret it. In other words, the AI so could become like a sort of dashboard for this impenetrable thing that was going on.
But I could chip in there as well if you like.
Yeah.
I should say hi, John. John is the face that I don't just recognise like a recognition software, but someone I know as a real person. So hi, John.
He's a real person, Ray.
Yeah. Hey, look. I think Yuval Noah Harari's a rather hysterical writer on these things myself, and the trouble with responding to someone who's a bit hysterical is it makes you a bit hysterical yourself. I'd even go so far as to say that his book *Sapiens* is one of the most dangerous books in print at the moment. And the reason is precisely because he doesn't have any sense of what it is to be human. For him, there's a race on between one form of robotics that lives in flesh called humans and another form of robotics that lives on silicon chips. And I'm not at all surprised that he just, churns out, and he has massive audiences, of course, one fearful scenario after another. You know, you've got to read that book and ask, what is the vision of being human that he has? It's a very poor, I think, shallow vision of what it is to be human. And then, you know, your question there about financial instruments. Well, of course, the bit that's missing is human greed. The financial instruments didn't make themselves, and they were fostered by a whole attitude towards what it is to be human too. And so it feels to me that addressing that is going to be a way to shape the future, not to try and sort of outrace one AI with another. Although I've no doubt that will happen as too.
Thank you. Have we got any more questions there?
Yes, from Nils Solanki.
Ah, Niles, hello.
Hi.
Hello, my love, how are you?
Very good, thank you. Full-mouthed though, in the process for eating while watching, to be honest.
Do you have a question?
Yeah, one of you mentioned the threat of deepfakes being used in the political arena. So basically politicians saying things in the videos that never happened, or images of politicians in situations that are completely fake. I was wondering, this is not necessarily a new threat. I mean, this scenario has been around for a long time. Does any of you here on the panel know if major political parties have come up with strategies to counter these kind of dangers, or if there is sort of a general good way to handle that?
Does anybody want to answer that?
Well, I haven't heard of any sort of emergency preparation. It's quite hard to see what you do. It's quite likely that they're wondering how they can make use of it themselves.
Yeah, that's
basically.
what I was thinking. Yeah. I'm not sure we have an answer
Because
to
it would
that.
save them from having to be interviewed.
Well, yes. You can get
Put
what
an
do you call those?
avatar of yourself.
An avatar, that's the one, yes.
Questions.
We'll all become avatars. Perhaps we should choose which one we want now. I don't know if that helps you, Niles, but I'm not sure that we can answer it for sure at this point.
But it's clearly things like Black Mirror have been showing us these kinds of dystopian potentials, and clearly there is that potential there. And I think that the thing is, how can we, are we able also to think of the optimistic scenario to offset that? Those are, if you like, the warnings. Well, are we preparing in the same way to do something that counteracts that, or that not simply counteracts, but that is positive in a way that precludes those things? And I'm not sure there's a whole lot of that going on.
No. I seem to have lost...
Here's an interesting one which I thought everyone might quite find amusing. So I've asked ChatGPT, is AI a force for good or evil? So ChatGPT is a chatbot, that's AI, that's probably the most commonly used one. So ChatGPT has said, AI itself is neutral. Its impact depends on how it's developed and used. Responsible and ethical implementations can lead to positive outcomes, whilst misuse or lack of oversight may result in negative consequences. So there you go. AI is quite balanced there in its view of itself.
Thank you for that.
It would say, wouldn't it?
Yes, exactly. It's trying to fool us.
Paul, we got any more questions?
Yep, we have another one from John Duncan.
John.
Well, actually, forgive me, the question is from me. I'm Sandra. I'm John's partner.
Hello, Sandra.
Pleased to meet you, Mark. I'm pleased to meet you virtually. I was very taken, Mark, with your discussion about human intelligence, and one aspect I strongly agreed with was your point about empathy, and what might be, we for a shorthand might call it the shadow side of empathy. If we keep all the empathy for those like us or those in our tribe, then we, in a sense, we have none to spare for those who are very different from us. And it can get worse than having none to spare. We can put a lot of energy into harming those who are not like us. And I do think that at the moment our society is suffering from that very greatly. And I sort of think quite a lot about capacity building. I think it's a matter very often of people's potential capacity not being realized. And it occurs to me, Hardin, with what you were discussing about the potential for AI to become conscious or to participate in consciousness, you know, how threatening that might be for us, because AI feels so alien, at least it does to me at the moment anyway. And it just strikes me that we seem to be putting a lot of energy and money into capacity building in AI, you know, building AI's capacity. But as a society, I'm not sure that we're investing in the same way in developing our own capacity to meet, cope with, embrace, engage creatively with this new phenomenon. So I just wanted to play with those ideas a bit in terms of how can we build our own empathy among humans, and is that a prerequisite before we can have empathy for AI?
Well, I think there is this notion in anthropology of an expansion of ethical concern from the tribe to the larger and larger social units. So although you might not see much of that in the sort of mass media, I think actually that is one of the characteristics of our time. Is one of the side effects of globalization is to make people more empathically conscious of the whole world, as it were. You know, the idea of the planet, concern for the environment of the whole planet, the ecology of the planet, which is something which is a width of concern that wouldn't have existed, maybe 200 years ago. People would have been perhaps concerned about their location or their area of countryside or their country. So I think that is going on. And in a way, and as to the empathy towards the conscious AI, that is sort of what I was trying to do by suggesting that the consciousness that it might have might not be something artificial. I mean, there's something wrong in a sense with that adjective, because maybe if it taps into, well, what should we call it? Real intelligence, real consciousness or real intelligence, and somehow channeling that's actually not going to be that alien. What we choose to do with it is going to be the big question. But so that, in a way, I was trying to sort of point to the fact that the sort of super AI might not actually turn out to be so scary after all.
I think, can I just say something?
I'm trying to be optimistic,
Yeah. Sorry, yeah, I mean, I think there is room for optimism here, definitely. We're talking about, tribes and different tribes. I didn't agree with very much of my father-in-law, but he did say one thing that I thought was amusing and correct. He said, we need to think of ourselves as earthlings. We're all earthlings. Not that we're English or Indian or everything, we're earthlings. So we're all in this together. The other thing I would say, and certainly I'm 71 now, and I've seen, with the whole internet, and we have no place to hide. We see what's going on. We're aware. I mean, back 50 years, 100 years ago, you probably wouldn't know there was a war going on somewhere else in the world. And if you did, you wouldn't know for weeks on end. So we have this, in a sense, we're almost not made to, but it's in our face. And there's less places to hide. So I think that is a hugely positive thing, that we need to start talking about the whole world and what's going on in another place in the world and another culture is affecting us. Everything affects everything else. I don't think we have a choice in that. So broadly speaking, I'm optimistic as well. Any more questions?
Maybe can I just throw one other thought in that might sort of add to a lot of what's been said, which is obviously so rich anyway. But just I'm thinking about empathy again. I think it's worth remembering that words like empathy are actually very recent neologisms. They're just a little over 100 years old. Altruism is another one that's used now as if it's always been a fixed part of human nature. But again, it's, you know, late 19th century word. And it's really interesting to ask, you know, why these words were coined at that time. And I actually wonder, to use your word there, I wonder whether it is to do with the sense that somehow within humanity itself, it must find the capacity to have these qualities of connection, whereas before they would have been felt as part of as part of nature, and even supernature, you might say, as a whole. You know, when we love, a medieval person might have said we're participating in God's love and reflecting that. And when we have sympathy, sympathy is an older word, and because it means more about resonating and harmonizing, rather than just a sort of one-on-one direct feeling, as it tends to mean now. But participating in a wider harmony, a wider whole. And again, it comes down to what you think humanity actually is. And if you think that we are sort of isolated units that are trying to bridge the gap between ourselves and other isolated units, also called human beings, and then, you know, these notions like empathy, I must somehow fill up with sympathy for someone else, or altruism, I must somehow make some sort of sacrifice because life's a zero-sum game, and if I don't win, you know, someone else will lose, and all that kind of stuff. And these notions, which are now very powerful in the 20th century, sure enough, you get a sort of sense of war of all against all. And, you know, if you're lucky, you survive, and probably the future's rather bleak. So again, an expansion of our sense of what it means to be human, I think, is really crucial here. And thinking about neologisms and the burden that they're being made to bear is another way of doing that, in fact. Yeah, very good point. Well, we're creeping towards the end. Is there any other questions, Paul, or anyone else would like to chip in?
That's it.
There's one from Annalisa at the bottom, seems to.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, it's not a question really. It was just a reflection that I was making, listening to you and your contribution, and what we were reflecting about the human consciousness. And I truly believe that if we go back to the question, is AI good or bad? I think as AI has replied, is neutral, is literally up to us as human consciousness to lead the dance. The more we will become evolved in our capacity in creating the good, I think that AI will be affected in the same way. If the balance goes to the negative, is in terms of human thinking and decision, AI will follow the same path, I believe.
Well, I think there's no doubt it is a powerful instrument that is going to become even more powerful. And I'm bound to say, you know, we need to become more and more self-aware. And of course, I'm bound to say become more spiritually aware. And hopefully people around the world are. And I think they are. I do feel positive about that.
I think that.
Any last words before we close? I want to thank my panelists and the questions that have come up today very much. I think what has happened here is it's actually so many things that we could talk about and have further webinars on that have come in, and hopefully we will. But I'm extremely grateful for all your comments, and bless you all. And I should perhaps say on a practical note that our next webinar is likely to be on the 18th of February. And it will be on education for the future. And I think the conversations we've had today on AI are very relevant to how we educate our children or educate ourselves, and particularly, obviously, psychospiritual education as well. But bless you all. Go well, keep the positivity in your thoughts, and energy follows thought. Let's put that out as a good vibe for the future.